The morning my father-in-law's estate lawyer smiled at my ex-husband and said, "Did you even read the full document, Callum?" That was the moment I understood that some people build traps so slowly, so quietly, that the person walking into them never hears a single click. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Renata. I was 34 when I married Callum Ashford and 39 when I finally sat in that lawyer's office on a Tuesday in November, watching the color drain out of my ex-husband's face like water out of a bathtub. The maple trees outside the window had already lost most of their leaves. The sky was that particular flat gray that settles over Ottawa in late autumn and doesn't leave until April. I remember thinking it was a very appropriate backdrop. I had married Callum at a small ceremony at a vineyard in Prince Edward County. His father, Howard, had paid for the wine. I remember Howard making a toast that evening, raising his glass and saying, in that dry, measured way of his, "To Renata, who is, without question, the most sensible decision my son has ever made." Everyone laughed. Callum, most of all. I should have listened more carefully to the things Howard didn't say. Callum and I had met through mutual friends at a gallery opening in the Glebe neighborhood. He was charming in that particular way that men are charming when they've grown up being told they're exceptional, effortlessly, almost lazily. He was an architect, or at least he had an architecture degree from Carleton that he referred to often and used rarely. When we met, he was working at a mid-size firm doing mostly residential renovations. Not glamorous, but steady. He had plans, he told me, big plans. He just needed the right opportunity, the right project, the right investor to see what he was capable of. I was a physiotherapist. I had my own small practice that I had built over 6 years, 3 of which were spent working out of a shared space in a clinic in Sentrytown before I had saved enough to lease my own unit. It wasn't a large operation, 2 treatment rooms, a part-time receptionist, a referral network I'd spent years cultivating. But it was mine. I paid my own bills. I had a line of credit I'd never touched. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. By the time we married, I knew Howard well enough to understand that he was the real center of gravity in Callum's life, even if Callum would never admit that. Howard Ashford had built a commercial real estate company from almost nothing in the 1980s, through 2 recessions, through periods when interest rates in Canada were at 15% and the banks were calling in loans. He was not a soft man, but he was a fair one, and he had, for reasons I can never entirely explain, taken a genuine liking to me. Callum's mother had passed away when Callum was 17. Howard had raised him alone after that, which I think explained some of Callum's particular texture, the way he could be generous and cold in the same breath, the way he needed to be admired more than he needed to be loved. Howard had compensated for his own emotional unavailability with money and opportunity and endless patience for Callum's failed ventures. There had been a restaurant concept that dissolved after 8 months, a real estate development project in Gatineau that lost a significant amount of Howard's money before it was quietly wound up, a consulting firm that existed primarily as a LinkedIn profile for about 14 months. Each time Howard wrote a check, each time Callum accepted it with the ease of someone who has never once considered that a safety net might eventually have limits. I didn't know how deep that pattern ran until I was already inside of it. The first year of our marriage, Callum was between projects. His words. He was working on a proposal for a mixed-use development near Lansdowne, something he was genuinely excited about, and I told myself the irregularity of his income was temporary. When my line of credit started carrying a balance, I assumed it was just a slow quarter. When I looked more carefully, I found charges I didn't recognize. A dinner at a restaurant in the market that I hadn't attended. A hotel booking in Montreal for a weekend I had spent at a conference in Vancouver. Subscriptions to services I'd never used. I asked Callum about them. He said they were for networking, client development, the kind of thing that looked like spending but was actually investing. He said it with such complete confidence that I spent 3 days convincing myself he was right before I found the credit card statements he'd been hiding in a folder he'd mislabeled in our shared drive as renovation quotes, archived. He had opened a supplementary card on my business account. He had done it 6 months before the wedding, during a period when I had added him as an authorized signatory to help manage some shared household expenses while I was recovering from a minor procedure and couldn't get to the bank easily. He had never mentioned he'd use that access to request an additional card. He had spent over 18 months, just over $28,000. The fight that followed was the worst we'd ever had. He told me I was treating him like an employee, that I had no vision, that the people he was meeting, the connections he was building, required a certain level of presentation, and if I couldn't understand that, then maybe I was the one holding them back. He slept in a second bedroom for 4 nights and then came back and apologized, and I, wanting very badly for things to be fine, let it go more completely than I should have. Howard called me a few weeks after that, not about the money. I hadn't told him. He called just to check in, which was unusual enough that I remember the call clearly. He asked how things were going. I said fine. There was a pause, and then he said, "Renata, if you ever need to talk about anything, I mean anything, I hope you know that door is open." I said thank you and changed the subject. I have thought about that phone call many times since. The architecture proposal fell through. The developer had gone with another firm. Callum was devastated in the dramatic, total way he was always devastated by setbacks, as though each failure was not just a professional disappointment, but a personal verdict against him. He spent 2 months barely leaving the apartment. Then he pivoted. He had a new idea, a design-build consultancy focused on sustainable residential construction. Very on-trend, he said. The market was there. He just needed startup capital and 6 months of runway. Howard gave him $380,000. I found this out at Christmas dinner, when Howard mentioned it in passing with the mild tone of someone discussing a utility bill. Callum looked at me across the table with an expression I couldn't entirely read. I smiled. I had become quite good at smiling. The consultancy lasted 2 years. It employed, at its peak, 2 contract workers and a bookkeeper. It produced 4 completed projects, all of them residential, all of them small. When Callum wound it down, he had repaid Howard none of the capital. He had, however, billed several of the projects through our joint account in a way that created some ambiguity, I discovered later, about which portion of the GST-HST filings were his and which were mine. I had hired an accountant by then. Her name was Josephine, and she was meticulous and unflappable, and she told me, in February of that year, that I should probably speak to a family lawyer as a precautionary measure. I made an appointment and then canceled it. I made another one 2 weeks later and canceled that as well. I kept thinking about the day I'd married Callum in Prince Edward County, the way the light came through the vines in the late afternoon, the way Howard had raised his glass. Howard had been ill since the autumn. Nothing that had been announced dramatically. It was just something I'd noticed on a Sunday dinner in September. The way he moved more slowly than usual. The way he'd refused a second helping of anything, which was unlike him. When I asked Callum if his father was all right, he said Howard was fine, just tired, probably just the season. I called Howard directly the following week. He told me it was his heart. He'd had some episodes. His cardiologist was monitoring it. He said he was at peace with whatever came, which frightened me more than anything else he could have said. Callum visited his father twice in the 3 months before Howard died. I visited 11 times. I know because I kept a calendar, not for any strategic reason, but because I was working around my clinic schedule and needed to plan. Howard and I would sit in his study, which smelled like old paper and cedar, and he would ask me about my patients, not by name, but by their situations, the things I'd told him over years. The retired postal worker learning to walk again after a hip replacement. The teenager with the repetitive strain injury from competitive swimming. He listened the way people listen when they're deciding what to remember. The last time I saw Howard, he was sitting in the chair by the window rather than behind his desk, which was new. He looked small in a way he hadn't before. He told me that he had made sure things were in order. He said, "You've always known your own worth, Renata. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I thought he was talking philosophically. I thought it was just being Howard, formal and fond in equal measure. I hugged him and said I'd see him Sunday. He passed away on a Thursday. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. Callum was distracted in the days leading up to it in a way that felt almost festive. He was making calls, meeting people for coffee, talking about a new venture he was considering, something in modular construction, very exciting, very well-timed. He bought a new blazer. He asked me, without apparent irony, if I thought he should lease a new car or buy one outright. I said I thought he should probably wait until after the will reading to make major purchases. He laughed and said I was always so cautious. We sat in the lawyer's office, Howard's longtime lawyer, a quietly formidable woman named Evelyn Cross, on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. There was also a representative from Howard's company and Howard's younger sister, Aunt Vera, who had flown in from Victoria and kept a very composed expression throughout. Evelyn read the will with the same energy someone might bring to reading meeting minutes. Thorough, unhurried, completely without performance. Howard's company was to be transitioned to its senior management team under a structured buyout agreement, the proceeds of which would be distributed over 5 years. A significant portion, Evelyn named a figure that made the room go very still, was directed to a charitable foundation Howard had established for affordable housing initiatives in the Ottawa-Gatineau region. Howard's personal real estate holdings, including a house in Rockcliffe Park, were to be sold, with proceeds divided between the foundation and a trust. Callum received a single, specific bequest, $250,000, held in a trust, dispersible only in installments and only upon demonstrated completion of a structured financial counseling program, 6 sessions, verified by a registered financial therapist per year for 5 years. Callum's face went through several stages very quickly. I received outright and unconditionally $140,000, clear title to Howard's small cabin property on a lake in the Rato Lakes area, and a letter. The letter was in a sealed envelope with my name on it in Howard's handwriting. Evelyn slid it across the desk to me without comment. I didn't open it in the room. I put it in my bag and kept my hands very still in my lap. Callum said, "This can't be right." Evelyn said it was, in fact, right, and asked if he had questions about the trust structure. He said, "He left her the lake house?" Evelyn said yes. Callum said, "She's not even his family." Evelyn looked at him for a moment over her reading glasses and said, gently but with some precision, "Your father felt differently about that." Aunt Vera caught my eye across the table and gave me a small nod. I held myself together until I reached the elevator. In the car, I opened the letter. Howard had written 3 pages in his compressed, deliberate handwriting. He said he had watched me for 5 years and had understood, earlier than I had, what the shape of my marriage was. He said he was sorry he hadn't said more, hadn't done more when there was still time. He said he knew I had covered expenses I should never have had to cover, had absorbed losses that weren't mine to absorb, had stayed longer than was good for me out of loyalty and, he suspected, out of a hope that things would change. He said he had tried, in the only way available to him after the fact, to correct the ledger slightly. He wrote, "The cabin is yours because you are the kind of person who will actually sit by the water and be quiet and let yourself recover. Callum has never once been able to sit still. I know my son. I love him. But I know what he is." He closed by saying he hoped I would stop apologizing for the space I took up and that he'd considered it a genuine privilege to know me. I sat in the car for a long time. The street was quiet. Someone walked past with a dog. After a while, I drove home. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. There were complications around the credit card debt under Ontario's Family Law Act. Debts accumulated during the marriage created some shared liability considerations, and my lawyer, a patient and extremely capable woman, worked through all of it carefully. In the end, the settlement was fair in a way that felt almost anticlimactic after everything. Not generous, not punishing, just accurate. Callum completed, as far as I know, none of the required counseling sessions in the first year of the trust disbursement period. That meant he received nothing from his father's estate that year. I heard this through Aunt Vera, who kept an occasional touch. I kept my clinic. I paid off the line of credit. I kept the lake property. It's a modest cabin, old but well-built, with a screened porch that faces west over the water. I started going up on long weekends in the spring and then for a full week in the summer, and by the second year I was blocking off 2 weeks in August without guilt. There are loons on the lake. In the evening, the light goes pink, and then orange, and then that deep particular gold that feels almost unreasonable. I hired a second physiotherapist. I finally took a real vacation. Portugal, 2 weeks, solo, something I'd been putting off for so long I'd stopped thinking of it as a real possibility. I brought Howard's letter with me, tucked in the inside pocket of my travel bag, not in a sentimental way exactly, just because it felt right to have it close. I am not angry anymore. That surprised me more than anything else. Not the money, not the cabin, not even Callum's face in that lawyer's office. What surprised me most was how cleanly the anger lifted once I stopped trying to manage it. I think about Howard sometimes, in the cabin, sitting on the screened porch in the early morning when the lake is still. He was not an easy man, and he was not a perfect father, and he knew both those things. But he paid attention, in the end, to what actually mattered. He noticed who showed up. He noticed who sat with him. He noticed who listened. That's not nothing. In my experience, it's quite a lot. I think about the moment Evelyn slid that sealed envelope across the desk to me, and how I didn't open it in the room. Part of me knew, even then, that whatever was inside it needed to be read somewhere quiet. Somewhere I could afford to feel it fully. What I've come to understand, sitting with all of this over the years since, is that Howard didn't just leave me a piece of property. He left me evidence. Evidence that the way I had lived, showing up, paying attention, choosing to care even when no one was watching, had meant something to someone. That sounds simple, but when you spent years in a marriage where your effort was either taken for granted or used against you, having that effort witnessed and named is not a small thing. It's actually enormous. Callum was not a cruel person in the way that word usually implies. He didn't set out to deceive me. I think he genuinely believed every time that the next venture would be the one that worked. What he lacked was not intelligence. He was perceptive when he chose to be, but a certain kind of honesty with himself. The kind that asks hard questions and waits for truthful answers instead of comfortable ones. Without that, all the charm and all the vision in the world just becomes a very convincing story you tell yourself while other people pay the tab. I was complicit in that for longer than I should have been. That's part of the accounting, too. What changed me wasn't the divorce, and it wasn't the inheritance. It was reading Howard's letter in a parked car on a gray November street and recognizing for the first time in years that I had not actually lost myself. I'd just been so busy managing everything around me that I'd stopped checking in. The person Howard described in those 3 pages, the one who noticed things, who sat with people, who built something real with her own hands and then kept building, that person had been there the whole time. I think that's what I'd call the real inheritance. Not the cabin, not the money. The reminder that your character is yours. Nobody can spend it without your permission, and nobody can take it in a divorce settlement. The financial damage Callum did took about 3 years to fully repair. The emotional damage took longer, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I did repair it by working steadily, by asking for help when I needed it, by refusing to let embarrassment keep me from making smart decisions. Josephine, my accountant, once told me that the most underrated financial skill is simply not quitting when the numbers are ugly. I think that's true about most things. Howard knew what he was doing when he structured that trust. He had watched his son receive bailout after bailout and understood, with the clarity that comes too late to most parents, that unconditional rescue isn't love, it's just postponement. The conditions he attached weren't punishment. They were, I think, a final attempt at the thing he'd never quite managed while he was alive, requiring Callum to sit still long enough to face himself. Whether Callum ever did that, I genuinely don't know. I hope so. Not for any complicated reason. I just think it's a miserable way to live, running from your own reflection. For my part, I go to the cabin as much as I can. The loons are back every spring. The porch faces west, and in August, the light at 7 o'clock is almost unreasonable in its beauty. I bring good coffee and bad novels, and I let the quiet do its work. Howard was right about that, too. I am exactly the kind of person who can sit by the water and recover.